So good afternoon again. I would like to welcome this time Susan Landau. She's a distinguished engineer at Sun, and she describes herself as having a funny combination of security, cryptography, and public policy as her job description, or at least job actions. She's published a book with Whit Diffie on the politics of wiretapping. She's worked on DRM. I will let her speak before you decide whether you're going to cheer or boo at that one, because I don't know, and also has worked in surveillance, and she's going to be giving a talk on internet surveillance, building our own Trojan horse. Susan Landau.
So I think I have to come to my own defense right away and say I'm the one who got the fair use stuff into our DRM project, and the one who did support for Creative Commons licenses before you all lynch me. And yes, I know this is being streamed over the internet. And as for surveillance, I'm the one who's writing stuff about why there are problems with surveillance rather than the other way around. So I want to start actually recently, not so recently, at some point I was listening to NPR. They were interviewing a folk singer, and this folk singer said that he has a mathematical formula when he does a concert for the order of his songs. I have a PhD in applied mathematics. I thought, cool. And so I waited to hear it. His mathematical formula was you do 2 happy songs and then 1 sad song, and you never end on a sad song. So, I learned something about what constitutes a mathematical formula. Anyway, the mathematical formula for today was not the right order. Jim spoke on games, and that was fun. And now I'm going to talk about stuff that is not fun. And the scheduling should have been different. Jim, you should have started with my downbeat talk and ended with Jim's upbeat talk, but you just have to run time backwards instead. What can I say? I wasn't in charge of scheduling. So now I'm going to start getting serious, and unfortunately I'm going to be serious for a while because I'm talking about internet surveillance. And I'm going to talk about security risks of building surveillance into communications infrastructures. Most of you are probably aware of the various government efforts on wiretapping, including applying wiretapping to voice over IP, etc. And there's been a lot of talk about civil liberties issues. I'm not going to talk about the civil liberties and privacy issues for a variety of reasons. One, they're not exactly a Sun issue. 2, there are plenty of people in Washington who can do a much better job than I on talking on the civil liberties aspects. What I, as a technologist and a scientist, bring to this discussion is talking about the security risks, which is something the civil liberties lawyers in D.C. don't necessarily know about. And that's been the focus of my work for the last several years. So when we think about the changes since September 11th, fortunately I drove here yesterday rather than flew. Everybody knows this picture of going through the airport screenings. For those of you in academia and who run conferences, you're probably aware of the various restrictions on visas and how much more difficult it has become for people to come to the U.S. I don't know how many of you are aware of the efforts on ID cards. I got a new driver's license a couple of weeks ago because my old one expired, and I'm pretty irritated. Because on the back of my driver's license, and I know that you all have driver's licenses and you know what they look like, but on the back of this license is unencrypted data about me. My height, my age, my birth date, all that kind, well, not my age, but my birth date, all that kind of stuff, it's unencrypted. Now, the Real ID is a driver's license that was designed according to a federal standard, and the federal standard did not require that the data in the back be encrypted, despite the fact that there were numerous studies, including a request by a federal advisory board, that there be a privacy/security protection of that sort. PIV, Personal Identity Verification Card, is a card that all people working at federal agencies have to have. It's supposed to be have a biometric. It was requested by the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, 2-3 years ago. They had an 18-month schedule to develop the card, the standards for the card, and start implementing. The problem with this is the very tight schedule meant that the card manufacturers, the people who build this sort of stuff, weren't ready. And more importantly, the PIV doesn't interact with the Common Access Card, the Defense Department card. And then the wiretap laws. Well, I sort of got off on a riff about the real ID. Let me go back to TSA airport screenings for a moment. TSA airport screenings are supposed to make us safer. What they do is cost a lot of time on the ground. They cause people to drive instead of fly. And there are various economic costs that succeed in making us less safe. And of course, many of us believe it's quite dubious that they do anything towards safety. So there are actual serious costs against safety there, and not clear that they're gains. The restrictions on visas, we may have kept out some of the bad guys, but we've kept out a lot of good guys too. And the number of people applying to be graduate students in the United States has dropped substantially. Europe has gained from this. The U.S., one of the strengths of U.S. is science and technology, and one of that strengths of science and technology is the foreign students who come here, study here, stay here, work in industry and academia, and we're cutting back on that. I've already told you about the risks on Real ID and PIV. What I'm here to talk to you about is the risks that are inherent in the various wiretap actions. So since September 11th, there have been a number of laws and actions on wiretap. The USA Patriot Act. Now I have to say here that in the defense of the government there are some pieces on the, and I'm only talking now about the wiretap aspects of the Patriot Act. There's some aspects of the Patriot Act that were not horrible. For example, the Patriot Act said that you do not need to get an individual subpoena for each district that a phone call travels through in order to be able to get the information about what number a number was calling or what number called a number. It had been the law that you had to get a subpoena in each district, and said no, one subpoena is enough. There are pieces that were fine. The U.S. communications, but there were many other pieces, the most important of which, I think, is actually the lowering of the wall between the law that enables wiretaps for criminal investigations and the law that enables wiretaps for foreign surveillance, foreign intelligence surveillance, and I'll get back to that in a minute. That wall was lowered, and I will explain that in a moment. In 2003, the FBI approached the FCC and asked that the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act be extended to VoIP. I will explain all of these in more detail in a few minutes. There was the Protect America Act, the law that said you do not need a warrant to wiretap a U.S. person if at least one end of the communication is reasonably believed to be outside the United States. That passed and had a 6-month time span on it. That passed in August last year. Under great pressure from the White House, it was extended for 2 weeks in late January. I didn't know what I was going to say when I came up here, because last Friday the House passed a bill extending that law, and I will talk more about that later. But why I didn't know what I was going to say when I came up here is we expected that on Monday or Tuesday the Senate was going to pass that law, and that I would be telling you about a bill that the President signed today. In fact, the Senate has not yet passed it. It's now thought that it might be delayed a couple of weeks, but the bill will still pass. And then the Cyber Initiative. The Cyber Initiative is a secret initiative. Pieces of it are public, but many pieces are not, in which the federal government is going to monitor the Internet for potential threats against critical infrastructure. So what I'd like to do now is talk to you about the various wiretap laws and put them in context. The U.S., the first national law, the first real national law we had on wiretapping was in 1968. It was a law to cover criminal investigations. The law is fairly restrictive, or was in 1968, as to when you could wiretap. The law came about in response to many different things. One was in the early 60s, it was finally acknowledged that organized crime is a serious problem. When this was acknowledged, after this was acknowledged, President Johnson put together a commission on organized crime, and it said various interesting things. It said it's very hard to investigate organized crime because one, local law enforcement is corrupted. Two, it's a victimless crime. It's gambling, it's prostitution that funds it. Those people are not, the victims of that crime are not going to come to law enforcement and say, hey, somebody took my money after I gambled with them. Hey, I used a prostitute. So it's very hard to do investigations. And the report said what you need to do is use wiretaps. Now, what was interesting is in 1968, gambling was funding organized crime. Both the wiretapping, but more specifically also the move by state governments to state lotteries, have done in gambling as a funding form for organized crime. What's changed is now you have prostitution and drugs. Okay, so we went from gambling funding organized crime to drugs funding organized crime. So Title III was passed. Now, Congress was very nervous about authorizing the FBI to wiretap. And the reason it was nervous is that back in 1928, there had been a Supreme Court case that said wiretapping is not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. It's not a search. You can do it. Congress got all agitated. Nothing happened. It got agitated, but it didn't pass any restrictions on wiretapping. But in 1934, it passed the Federal Communications Act, which said no interception and divulgence of wired communications. So when the next wiretapping case came up to the Supreme Court in 1937, instead of it being argued on the basis of constitutional protections, the lawyers argued it on the basis of the Federal Communications Act, and the Supreme Court justices said no interception and divulgence of wired communications, i.e. no wiretapping. 2 years later, the same case came back and said, can law enforcement wiretap and then take what they've learned from the wiretap, not present it in court, but use it to further the investigation, and then use that evidence? And the Supreme Court said, no fruit of the poison tree. Important issue is this was 1939. The other thing that happened in 1939 was the beginning of the Second World War. Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, went to Roosevelt, the president, and said, I need to be able to wiretap illegal aliens. And so Roosevelt gave him an exemption for wiretapping wiretapping aliens. That exemption was extended after Roosevelt died, but it was no longer limited to aliens. However, there was still this Supreme Court ruling that said no wiretapping. So what do you do if you're the FBI and you're allowed to wiretap by the president and you're not allowed to wiretap by the Supreme Court? You wiretap, but you don't admit it's a wiretap. You say, a confidential source told me that. And FBI agents would go into the courts and say, a confidential source told me that, blah, blah, blah. And if it ever came out that it was actually a wiretap, then the case got thrown out because you weren't allowed to wiretap. Well, this was a mess. You had the organized crime stuff happening. So what happened finally in 1968 is Title III. Now, the other thing that was going on is Hoover was not only wiretapping bad guys, he was also wiretapping Supreme Court justices, someone who became President of the United States, John Kennedy, that was actually a bug, not a wiretap, members of staff of members of Congress. This got very sticky. Because when you're a member of Congress and you're trying to do something on the FBI, like cut its budget, it's very hard when the FBI has wiretapped you and they have some stuff on you that doesn't sound so good. So Congress decided to limit how the FBI could wiretap, and they said, has to be a serious crime. One of this list of 25. That list is by now up to almost 100. One of this list of 25. Phone has to be part of the stuff used in the commission of the crime. Has to be essentially last resort. Okay? That's 1968. 1978, it took 10 years. 1978, Congress wrote another law, FISA, for foreign intelligence. Now, intelligence and law enforcement are really different. Law enforcement, you want to catch the bad guy, put him in jail. Foreign intelligence, you want to figure out what the bad guys are doing. You want to disrupt them, but you don't necessarily want to put them in jail because you don't want to admit what your sources of information are. Okay? So there's a lower form of evidence you need for a bad guy when the bad guy is you're doing a foreign intelligence wiretap. And the lower piece of evidence is you don't need to know that they're committing a serious crime. You simply need to know that they're an agent of a foreign power. A foreign power has since been amended to be a terrorist group, and the terrorist group can be size 1. That is, a single bad guy acting as a terrorist group. Now, I told you there was a change in the Patriot Act. It used to be, pre-Patriot Act, in order to take a foreign intelligence wiretap and make it into a Title III wiretap, into a criminal investigation, you needed that foreign intelligence was a significant aspect of the wiretap in order to get the wiretap. It's now changed to, it needed to be a primary reason for the wiretap. It now needs only to be a significant aspect. That means you've lowered the bar on how you can do a criminal investigation. Okay, enough wiretap history. Most wiretap law in the U.S. is based on Title III and FISA, except for, in 1994, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And this is my one legal slide, almost my one legal slide. In 1994, FBI went to Congress. Actually, they went first in 92, but they didn't get anywhere. They tried to get in 1994. They went to Congress and they said, we're having a terrible time wiretapping. There's all this new type of technology. You know, there's call forwarding, and we can't wiretap when there's call forwarding because the digitally switched networks make it impossible. Okay? What are the digitally switched networks? A little bit of technology without a picture. You put the these days you put the wiretap on in what's called the central office, the switching office nearest the phone. In call forwarding, the call doesn't go down the line, it gets switched at the central office and goes somewhere else. So if the wiretap is on at the central office, the wiretap never gets activated because the call doesn't go down that line. Congress passed in 1994, CALEA, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. It said that all telephone switches must be built wiretap accessible, standards designed by the federal government, which in this case the agent of the federal government was the FBI. Okay? Now, there was an exemption for information services. This is 1994. Information services means the Internet. Protect America Act updated FISA. Why did FISA need an update? FISA said you need a warrant when you're wiretapping a U.S. person, which means somebody in the U.S., whether they're a citizen or not, or a U.S. corporation, except in the case where you're listening to the following funny type of communication. On a radio, at least one person receiving the call, the communication, is not a U.S. person. Okay? So that meant that NSA did not have to put a floating platform 3 miles outside the U.S. to pick up a communication that came from the U.S. and was going to someone outside the U.S. Okay? That got problematic when we moved from radio satellite communications to fiber. And NSA said, look, it shouldn't matter what type of technology it is. But the change in the Protect America Act was much broader. It said, you don't need a wiretap as long as you reasonably believe at least one end of the communication is outside the United States. I don't know what reasonably believe means. And I'm serious. Cyber initiative, and I don't mean I don't understand it. I mean it's very hard to figure it out. And I've already told you about the cyber initiative. So I want to talk a little bit about risk. And we face serious risk. There is no question that groups like Al-Qaeda would like to get their hands on nuclear weapons. We face dangers of nuclear explosions in cities, including dirty bombs. We also face what I would call small risks, terrorists blowing up buses and trains. I'm talking about the difference in death between 100,000 or 1 million people and 150 people. I'm not saying that what happened in Madrid or London is easy to deal with, but I am saying there's a difference in order of magnitude. We also face natural disasters. 1,800 people killed in Katrina, many, many more in the Indian Ocean tsunami. And there were, in fact, many other natural disasters at other times. What we really want to ask is how efficacious are the proposed solutions? So during the early 1990s, when the FBI was going to Congress and saying, we need to be able to wiretap in digitally switched telephone networks and we're having trouble, they kept saying that they were having trouble in kidnapping cases. They would go into each congressman and they would say, you know, how would you feel if a kid in your district was kidnapped and we weren't able to tap the line? Wiretaps were also used in other investigations. As I told you, in fact, the vast majority were drug cases. How else are wiretaps used? Well, This is not exactly wiretaps, but in June 2006, the Department of Justice said in a counterterrorism paper that 441 defendants were charged with terrorism or terrorism-related activities of an international nexus. Okay, so since 2001, you have 441 defendants in the U.S. charged with terrorism cases. But you want to look at the data a little more carefully, which in the first case is what Diffie and I did when we wrote our book, Privacy on the Line. We looked at the kidnapping cases. Turns out that wiretaps were used in an average of 2 to 3 kidnapping cases a year between 68 and 94. That's out of an average of about 450 kidnapping cases a year. Why aren't wiretaps used in kidnapping cases? 2 reasons. Reason 1 is you don't know who the kidnapper is. So how can you put a wiretap on? Reason 2 is if you're listening on the family's line, that's not a wiretap in terms of law. It's called a consensual overhear, and it's not a wiretap in terms of technology. You don't need to put a wiretap on. You need to put an extension on. So it's no surprise that the numbers are so low. By the way I know these numbers is there's something called the wiretap report that's issued each year by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. It lists every single Title III wiretap in the country, who the DA was, who the judge was, who authorized it, how long it went for, how many people were wiretapped, how many incriminating conversations, how many non-incriminating conversations, how many arrests, how many convictions, what the most serious crime was. That oversight, which was decided in 1968, was remarkably useful when we were trying to debunk the issue about kidnapping. It's also been very useful because many of you know there were fights about the use of strong encryption in the 1990s. And Senator Patrick Leahy from Vermont said, you know, the wiretap report should now list how often investigators run into encryption on phone calls. There was one case in the last 6 years that caused any problem for investigators. One case of encryption. Pretty interesting. There were cases of encryption, but only one case that caused any serious problem. And as I said, wiretaps were used for a number of other investigations, including gambling originally, but as organized crime moved away from gambling, it's now mostly drugs. I mentioned the number of arson and explosive cases because that's, of course, where terrorism is. It's hard now to report on how many terrorism cases are investigated through wiretaps because there are 2 types of wiretaps. I've told you the information about Title III. The only piece of information available about FISA taps is how many there are. Okay, and that's the only thing I can tell you. I told you about the Department of Justice counterterrorism report, which said there were 441 defendants arrested on cases of terrorism of an international nexus. They included some real bad guys, like Sheikh Abdul Rahman, who was the guy who provoked the first World Trade Center bombing, Zakaris Moussaoui, Richard Reed. Richard Reed is the one who tried to blow up a plane coming back to the U.S. But of the 335 persons prosecuted between 2001 and 2006 as international terrorists, only 14 had sentences of 5 years or more and only 6 of 20 years or more. My point is you need to look at the data, okay? If you want to ask, are wiretaps worth it, you got to look at data, okay? How efficacious are wiretaps? We need to ask, what is the cost of the proposed solutions? How long will this war last? What are the long-term costs? Are we looking at long-term risk versus short-term gain? And I want to point out that the use of extensive surveillance was previously limited to times of war. We're in a very funny war. We've been in a state of war since 2001. It's essentially 7 years now. Our society has changed far more radically than I could have ever imagined 7 years ago. The real question as technologists that we should be asking, the real question in society but also in technologists, is how well do these work? On the one hand, we want to enable law enforcement and national security investigations versus hardening communication systems. So now I get to the technology part of my talk. As I said, the law, CALEA, originally applied to telephone services, not information services. In 2003, the FBI asked that it be extended to voice over IP. What happened then is the FBI went to the FCC, which is the agency, the Federal Communications Commission, is the agency in charge of deciding whether or not to modify the regulations. We were kind of surprised it went to the FCC, but we figured, okay, FBI is going to go to the FCC. The FCC is going to turn it down because, after all, it says no information services. It's really clear. It says anything that's a substantial replacement for telephone, you can extend CALEA to, but then it has a very clear exemption for information services. The FBI will go to the FCC will turn the FBI down, the FBI will go to Congress and say, we tried with the FCC, we need a new law. To our surprise, the FCC did not turn the FBI down. When I say to our surprise, I'm talking both about civil liberties groups and also about industry groups. The FCC authorized the extension of CALEA to voice over IP. We took the case to the courts. There was a 2-to-1 decision in the Court of Appeals. 2 judges said, yes, the FCC has the authority to extend. 1 said, go read the law. The law has a clear exemption. The FCC extended CALEA to easy cases of VoIP. It did not extend CALEA to Skype on my laptop to your laptop. It extended CALEA to VoIP using my telephone, essentially, to your telephone with his VoIP in the middle, what's called interconnected VoIP, where the middle can be VoIP, but the outside doesn't need to be. That's a pretty easy case of VoIP. That doesn't present technological challenges. In 2006, the FBI sought to extend CALEA to many more cases of VoIP. Any case of VoIP, for example, where the coffee house or any other place was bigger than 300 square feet. So any Wi-Fi provider of more than 300 square feet, this hotel, the Starbucks, etc. That did not go through, in part because of lack of support within the Senate for anybody to push the bill forward. In 2007, the FCC asked that anybody who gets new broadband access should provide call identifying information on packet activity, that is transactional information, for all online applications. What the Protect America Act did, that's a picture of the world, as you can tell, and the U.S. is in the middle of it. And the U.S. is in the middle of it not just because we're U.S.-centric here, but because a lot of communications between different parts of the rest of the world go through the United States. For example, to call South America from South America, it used to be you could use a satellite, but it's a lot faster to use the fiber optic cable that goes in and out of Miami to call 2 parts of South America. Sometimes to call 2 parts of Europe go through the U.S. Certainly to call between Europe and Asia goes through the U.S. And the NSA wanted an update to FISA to be able to get that. Problem was that the location of a call, especially if the communication is an internet communication, is difficult to find in real time. You guys know a lot about this sort of stuff and understand when I say that why it's true. As I said, the law expired in January 2008. I've expected the renewal this week. It hasn't happened yet. Let me talk a little bit, and of course this stuff is probably familiar to many of you, why the problem of surveilling the internet is hard. And the reason is that circuit switched and packet switched networks are not the same. Of course, they look the same. They use the same kind of transmission facilities, often sharing the same cable. They use electric routing switches. They use transmission links and switching and routing equipment parsimoniously. They use digital transmission and time division multiplexing. Often they're using each other's facilities. Okay, they often, both an internet provider may provide support for circuit switching and vice versa. The PSTN but there are also ways in which they're fundamentally different, and the fundamentally different is actually the more important part. The phone company, the PSTN, the Public Switch Telephone Network, historically used expensive switches to provide quality, and it was quality for one particular application, voice. Whereas the Internet and ARPANET used relatively expensive routers. We're moving a little bit now to quality of service and changing things, but the model of Internet architecture was smart terminals, dumb network. The model of the PSTN is smart network, dumb terminals. In fact, very dumb terminals. I was at a friend's house last night, and they had one of those telephones like existed in my parents' house in 1950. Okay, backward compatible terminal called a telephone. Okay? People don't replace their wireline telephones every 3 years to every 2 years the way we do with these guys. Okay? And these two differences are actually the important differences when you're trying to wiretap. If I look at applying CALIA to voice over IP, I need to look at what's important about voice over IP. There's a variety of voice over IP models. Model 1 can be Skype, my laptop to your laptop. Model 2, it can be, I forget who it is, who uses telephone to call in to the phone company, but then VoIP between the phone company and then back a telephone the other end. It can be any model in between. It's mobility. I have an IP address right now, but I had an IP address when I was sitting down there, then I was listening to Jim Waldo's talk for a few minutes, or concentrating more. I was listening the whole time, concentrating more. I lifted my laptop back on. I probably had a different IP address. I walked down the hallway. I had a different IP address. I went into a Starbucks. I had a different IP address, and so on. I go to the airport. I have a different IP address. I can have different IP addresses every couple of minutes if I'm sitting logging on back and forth when I'm sitting here, every 10 minutes. Mobility. And then there's, of course, the ease of creating new identities on the Internet. Traveling, it's very nice to have an address that says Susan in London, July '07, Susan in London, Susan in Paris, August '08, so that I can use that address if I'm doing business on the Internet, but then I get rid of that address because spam disappears, because I don't want my spam. Any spam. What's complicated about applying CALIA to VoIP? Exactly the same set of things. There's a variety of VoIP models, mobility, and ease of creating new identities on the Internet. Okay? People used to have their phone numbers for decades, certainly for years, not for weeks, not for days. So you might ask me, don't we already wiretap mobile communications? And the answer is yes. We do it in two different ways. We might wiretap cell phones. And that's kind of interesting because it's easy to wiretap a cell phone when it's in its base district, when it's in its home district. No problem there. It's easy to wiretap a cell phone. Now let me see if I can get this one right. When somebody is calling the cell phone, regardless of where the cell phone is, because the call comes into the home base, and then the home base knows where it's supposed to go, so you can activate the wiretap. But when the cell phone is traveling, the first time the cell phone makes a call out, it goes back to its base station. The base station says, yes, this is an authorized cell phone, bills are up to date, everything's cool, and the call goes through. Next time it's in that same district, nothing happens. The billing information doesn't slow the call down at that particular instant. So wiretapping there is complicated. We also enable, as of, I think, 1994, maybe, I don't remember, sometime between 86 and the mid-90s, what's called roving wiretaps. Roving wiretaps, it used to be on the wiretap order, you had to specify who you were tapping and what phone number they were at. But bad guys like to move around and they think you're wiretapping their home, they're going to go to Joe's Pizza. So you can get a wiretap order that says, or law enforcement can get a wiretap order that says, we want to intercept this bad guy, but he's roving and we are going to intercept him at his roving places. Judge needs to listen and be assured that they're really doing the right thing and then gives the order. But that means when the bad guy is making that phone call from Penn Station, you don't activate all the phone taps. You don't activate the taps on phones 1, 2, 3, and 4 at gate 11. You activate the wiretap at gate 2, phone 2 at gate 11 when you see him use phone 2. Okay? This is an expensive thing to do because it means somebody has to be watching each of the phones. I want to give you a picture of why wiretapping with mobility is so hard. So, I work in crypto, so I've got Alice and Bob sitting there, and Alice is this little the little box on the left, and Bob is this little box on the right, because of course you don't really need people in this. And Alice is sitting at the Starbucks, that's ISP A. Bob is sitting at, ISP C, and Bob is sitting, at the hotel lobby, that's ISP D. And Alice wants to call Bob. So she knows Bob is at Bob's VoIP provider is, let's say, Verizon. So she tries to do a call. So ISP C says, oh, Alice is trying to do VoIP with Bob. I got to go up to Alice's VoIP provider, who happens to be ISPA. ISPA says, oh, she wants to talk to Bob, and Bob's provider is ISPB. Bob's provider says, oh, Bob is online. Cool. He's at D. And so ISPB sends to ISPA Bob's IP address. You guys with me? I know I'm not doing this with a pointer, but I don't think it's that hard. ISPA sends to ISPB Alice's IP address. Then Bob and Alice each have each other's IP addresses, and they never have to go through A and B again for this particular call. Where does the wiretap order get placed? It gets placed at ISPA and ISPB, because law enforcement doesn't know where Alice is going to be sitting at this particular point. And if Alice is sitting right over there, law enforcement doesn't know, or right over there, law enforcement doesn't know her IP address, because she opened her laptop, got an IP address, closed her laptop, got a different IP address. It's not easy. Mobility makes this kind of wiretapping, excuse me, extremely difficult. Now, of course, you could outlaw mobility. You could outlaw VoIP applications and IM applications and all sorts of things. You could make the internet have the same architecture as the telephone, but that would be really dumb. There are lots of problems when you try to build this type of wiretapping capability into the internet. Problem number one is that there are a lot more ISPs than there are telcos, telephone companies. Last time I checked, there were 1,300 VoIP providers in the United States with fewer than 100 employees. If you're a VoIP provider with 100 employees, how many people are devoted to full-time security? Lots, right? You know, at least 40 or 50, right? And they're going to secure your network and secure the physical facility and everything else, including, you know, the VoIP provider at Starbucks and so on. And, well, that's T-Mobile, but you get the point. Another problem is the ease of creating new identities on the internet, the secure transport of signals to law enforcement. Because the wiretapping is on the internet, where things are much easier to discover than on the telephone network, there's an increased risk that the target will discover the wiretap is in place, which of course messes up the value of the wiretap. There's the difficulty of ensuring proper minimization. Minimization is the legal requirement that a wiretap only tap the person who's named in the wiretap order, and only when they're talking about the criminal activity. Well, how do you do it when Alice keeps moving around and changing IP addresses? The IETF looked at this issue way back in 2000, and they said, you know, putting wiretapping into protocols is a real mistake because it increases the complexity of a protocol, and that's a real risk of introducing a vulnerability. And then finally, search engines plus vulnerabilities is a dangerous combination. Before we had search engines, there was a vulnerability on somebody's machine. Bad guy could discover it by searching, you know, looking over, going somewhere, accessing a point, and then discovering in the way that Clifford Stoll explains about NASA, that way, poking around a lot. Now, you know about a vulnerability? You do a Google search to try and find out who's running that unpatched system. It's not hard at all. What's the real problem? The real problem is we're applying an old model to a new system. People call people, not IP addresses. And if you're trying to wiretap VoIP on a fixed line directly to a large ISP, what the FCC approved in 2006, that's easy. Anything else is hard unless you break the model of the internet. So when I tell you it's easy, it's not just theory. I wrote a paper with Matt Blaze, Steve Bellevin, you can find it on my webpage, on a whole bunch of people on the risks of applying CALIA to VoIP. At the time, we posited risks. We expected to find those risks, but we didn't have proof. Now we have proof. The FBI has a wiretapping system of CALIA. Papers got released under the Freedom of Information Act litigation filed by EFF. We took a look at them last summer. We discovered the auditing system is primitive. There's no unprivileged user IDs. Passwords are used rather than token-based or biometric authentications. This is for a rule of law. This is for a court case. You can't do a chain of custody. They were using MD5 in a 2007 document. We knew that MD5 had problems long ago. long ago in computer years. There was a single shared login rather than a login by user. I told you about problems with CALEA. Let me tell you about problems with the Protect America Act. It used to be that when you did a wiretap, you went to the phone company and you said, here's my wiretap order. And the phone company looked at the wiretap order and made sure it was in order. Sometimes it didn't actually happen that way. Sometimes the law enforcement guy called the phone company and they had a previous relationship, and so they were willing to put it on before they saw the physical piece of paper. If you remove the phone company from the equation, so why do I say you might remove the phone company from the equation? Well, as all of you probably know, a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, it was revealed that in the San Francisco office of AT&T's San Francisco office, there was a secret room in which the fiber optic cable was being shunted off. So the signal was split, half of it went into this secret room where it was filtered, and then it went somewhere east to a large government agency. The interception was happening without the phone company looking at each wiretap order. I've had government people say to me, look, the very act of preparing a wiretap order, the specificity required is a good exercise for us. It causes us to examine whether this is appropriate. If you remove that specificity, because you don't have to do it for the phone company, you're running into problems. The AT&T telephone switch is in San Francisco. Now, if I go back to that map I showed you, it was awfully large scale. It didn't show you where the cables come in from different parts of the world. 4 of them come in on the West Coast, equal number on the East Coast, 5 from Canada, 5 from Mexico. Those numbers are true as of 2002. There may be a little bit more since then, but we had overcapacity in 2002. If you put the taps on at the cable heads, you're almost entirely getting calls foreign to U.S. or U.S. to foreign or foreign to foreign. You know, of course, Michigan to New York could go through Canada, and then you'd be picking it up. But mostly you'd be getting at least one end foreign. If you put the tap on in the San Francisco office of AT&T, you're also going to get Silicon Valley calling Silicon Valley. That's not minimization. That's U.S. person to U.S. person. Another danger is that you're likely to be using pieces previously used abroad. Why is that a problem? Because other people have been looking at it. That is, other people than U.S. national security. And they know how it works, and they know what pieces of it don't work as well as they should. And that gives them ways to break into it. You're building a wiretap, or the U.S. government is building a wiretap system of calls within the United States. And that creates a serious risk. And then finally, call detail records. Call detail records are something that the phone company builds for itself. It wants to know how you're using the telephone, so it can figure out new services. It can figure out how to market its services, and so on. Perfectly legitimate business activity. But when you build a database, when you build any kind of information system, you build it with one type of security risk in mind. You build it with one kind of threat model. When you take that information system and you move it over somewhere else, it has a different threat model, which you haven't protected against. And right now the call detail records have new customers. It's called the new customers of the U.S. government. There are a number of risks. There's the risk of exploitation by opponents. There's a lack of what I've called two-person, two-organization control. There's a lack of inherent technical minimization of traffic. And there's the danger that domestic traffic, that is U.S.-based traffic, is moving into the government agency that's doing the eavesdropping that hasn't built technical safeguards into its system, because its system was built for monitoring foreign traffic, not U.S. traffic. So you got to ask, what are the types of threats we face? Well, we face threats from non-state actors. That's the one we hear about the most, terrorist groups. We face threats from state actors, other governments. We've faced that for a long time. I would say the threat went down with the demise of the Cold War and has since increased because of the internet and because of the growing economic strength of certain parts of the world. We face threats from insiders. So let me tell you about non-state actors first. If you go back to the 1990s, the most interesting case that the case that I consider most interesting is that in 1998, a teenager was hacking a phone switch in the middle of Massachusetts, disrupted the phone switch, and that disabled the Worcester Airport tower communications for a number of hours. Now, the reason I'm particularly interested in that case is, one, it was the first attack on critical infrastructure that I know about, and two, it occurred because the phone switch didn't require authentication. You know, there was this problem about crypto, and while authentication and use of crypto for authentication was perfectly legitimate, because of all the problems about use of crypto for confidentiality, people weren't using crypto as much as they should have. They weren't deploying it. Result was that phone switch didn't have crypto in it, the teenager disrupted it, the phone tower, the airport control tower in Worcester Airport went down. Now, Worcester Airport doesn't actually get a lot of traffic, but nonetheless. There was an attack on a sewage treatment plant in Maroochy-shire, which released thousands of gallons of untreated sewage. That one, well, enough about that one. Slammer worm disabled safety monitoring equipment at the David Spessy nuclear power plant. The power plant was offline at the time. The reason this occurred is they had firewalls up at the power plant, but a contractor didn't have his laptop protected. And the contractor was permitted into the network because, you know, he was a contractor, he was working for the system, but he didn't have a firewall up on his thing. And then there was a penetration into a Harrisburg water filtration plant for the distribution of spam. So while the incident was not in itself serious, the threat was. Let me talk a little bit about state actors. And this is a particularly interesting case to me, because it was the same group of people that went into for the same vulnerability in 4 defense institutions in the space of, 6 hours, 6.5 hours. They found vulnerabilities at the U.S. Army Information Systems at Fort Wakucha at 10:23 p.m., at 1:19 a.m., same holes in Dissa in Arlington at 3:25 a.m. They hit the Naval Ocean Systems Center, and at 4:46 they struck the U.S. Army Space and Strategic Defense installation. They took out helicopter plans. They took out various other plans, stuff that was classified, not incredibly dangerous stuff, but that is not nuclear weapons production sorts of stuff, but still stuff that was classified. The stuff went first to Taiwan and Korea, and from there to the PRC. Was it state actors? We surmise as much. One interesting question is how one might stop this, and I've heard a very nice discussion by Alan Powler where he talks about humiliating the people who did it. That's the sort of thing that actually works the best in this particular situation. Threats from insiders. Historically, this is the most dangerous type of threat, because these guys know your system, they know your auditing system, they know your vulnerabilities, they know everything about you. Who have been the bad actors here? For those of you who know your history, Kim Philby in the UK did huge damage. He was a spy working for the British government, but he was a Russian spy. He was a Brit who was a Russian spy working for the British government. Huge amount of damage. Aldrich Ames was working for the FBI. He gave the Russians 10 names of Russian spies. He covered up his tracks for a long time because he was working in counterintelligence. He did a huge amount of damage to the U.S. Threats from insiders are the most dangerous threats. So now think about what we're doing. We're putting surveillance infrastructure into our surveillance capability into our communications infrastructure. And of the 3 types of threats I mentioned, non-state actors, state actors, and insiders, who are we enabling? We're enabling insiders. And insiders are small groups. They're much harder to find. Insiders are often groups of 1. My attacks that I'm describing, these attacks that I'm describing, they're not my attacks. These attacks that I'm describing are not hypothetical. It's a wonderful story in IEEE Spectrum by Prevalakis, and I'm not going to remember the other author, on an attack on Vodafone Greece. Between June 2004 and March 2005, more than 100 phones belonging to members of the Greek government, including the Prime Minister, the Ministry of Defense, the equivalent of our Department of Justice, the opposition, were wiretapped. The way they were wiretapped was really quite interesting. Vodafone had purchased phone switching from Ericsson. They had not purchased the wiretapping capability. So Ericsson had not included the auditing software for the wiretapping. But the wiretapping capability was not turned on by Vodafone. It was turned on by somebody acting inside Vodafone. Because the auditing capability wasn't purchased, it wasn't there. So there was no auditing done. The phones were tapped, and the taps were sent to I think either 14 or 16 cell phones in the Athens area. There was a rootkit installed that hid all the activity, and of course hid activity of the rootkit hid activity of updates. This was discovered in March 2005 when an SMS went awry. Vodafone began investigating, and as they began investigating, the wiretapping shut down. We understand how it happened. We don't understand who did it. Telecom Italia. There's massive alleged wiretapping occurring at Telecom Italia. That seemed for money rather than for national security. The targets included many public figures, magistrates, politicians, sports players, referees. The target was blackmail. The former chief of security at Telecom Italia was arrested. I think what we've got here is contrasting notions of computer security. I suspect everybody in this room carries with them the traditional notion of computer security: availability, integrity, confidentiality of the systems. The systems you work on, the systems you maintain. That's what we think of. But in the last 5 to 10 years, there's a new notion of cybersecurity. And this new notion is we should protect against attacks by network systems, attacks on critical infrastructure, and attacks on networked information systems. And these two contrasting notions play their way out in somewhat different ways. Traditional computer security says, harden your machines, reduce your vulnerabilities, provide defense in depth. Cybersecurity does something else. It checks the road. Who's out there, what they're doing, why they're doing it. It's a very different threat model and a different model of security. And I'm arguing that this protection introduces vulnerabilities, or can introduce vulnerabilities. So I want to talk about risk. We have serious risks: the nuclear explosions in cities, the small risks, terrorists blowing up buses. Let me tell you a little bit more about risks. This is a picture of September 11th. By the way, it's distributed under a Creative Commons license with attribution required. Here is Katrina, also a Creative Commons licensed photo. What risks do we face? Katrina had 1,800 dead and huge economic damage. The Indian Ocean tsunami, 283,000 dead. In 1931, there was a flood in the Yellow River. We don't think about it much in the United States. I didn't know about it until I started looking at this stuff. 1 to 2 million dead. It wasn't the only time that the Yellow River flooded. It also flooded in 1887 with about the same number dead. In 1970, there was a cyclone in Ebola, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million dead. In 1556, 830,000 dead in Shanxi. Why am I showing you these numbers? To make the point that natural disasters happen, and they happen with large numbers of people getting killed, and even larger number of people getting injured. What do we need in terms of communications security? What does society need? We need to be able to secure civilian communications. We need to enable secure communications in times of national and international disaster, whether it's natural or otherwise. And we need to enable successful investigations of criminal and terrorism cases. And I would argue that we need to do it in that order. That in particular, if we don't secure civilian communications, we run a huge risk to our infrastructure and to American business and also to American citizenry. The other two, I think, are completely obvious as well. We need to ask questions like, how do we secure first responder communications? What communications worked during 9/11 and Katrina? So I was up at the Sun office in Burlington on September 11th. And of course, the telephone networks went down immediately when the World Trade Center's buildings fell. The internet was working fine a mile away. One of my colleagues, his wife works down in New York. She was about a mile away from the World Trade Center. They were emailing back and forth all day. VoIP communications were reestablished in Louisiana very quickly. The internet, after all, was built to be robust and route around disaster. We want to ask what's easy to use after a disaster? What are the types of disasters in which we'll need such communication systems? What are we protecting against and what we should be developing for? In the crypto wars, there were a number of reasons the U.S. government allowed the export of strong crypto. In many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, changed its position in 2000. One of them had to do with ad hoc military networks, ad hoc military communications. When you have an alliance like NATO, you have years to develop a secure communications infrastructure. When you have a military alliance like occurred in the first Iraq War, which was put together over a matter of months, you don't have years to do that, you have months. It's a whole lot easier if everybody's buying communications devices that have secure pieces in them, like the advanced encryption standard. Okay? Civilian agencies need the ability to set up secure ad hoc communications as well. Whether it's, the police from Texas interacting with the police from Arkansas and the fire department from Arkansas and helping in Louisiana, or the different communities helping in the World Trade Center. You need to be able to enable secure ad hoc communications networks. You need to secure civilian communications by securing personal and business communications, securing communications that use the internet as a backbone, and securing communications that use private networks, such as the electronic power grid, private networks that use internet protocols. We are in a different environment than we were when the wiretap laws were passed. We have credit cards, frequent flyer numbers, frequent buyer numbers. Data mining is a huge industry. My father was a jeweler in Manhattan in 1960, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. People paid cash. They would walk in and roll off $200 for a piece of jewelry. People don't pay $30 cash anymore. They pull out a credit card and leave an electronic record. There was one drug dealer who was partially caught by the records of his frequent flyer numbers. He registered every flight down to South America for his miles. Storage of transactional data. Everybody talks about how the power of Moore's law. Nobody talks about how the price of storage is dropping by a factor of 2 just as quickly. Data is being stored, and in particular, transactional data. Who's calling whom when? We're in a different communications environment than we were in the 1960s and 70s. Most of you broadcast your location all the time via your cell phones. Some of us don't carry cell phones, but most of you do. And then CCTV, on average, every Brit is on CCTV. I think it's 140 times a day. There are 2.5 million cameras in the UK, unless it's gone up since a few weeks ago. We also need to think about terrorism cases. Jail may not be the answer. We are in a different situation in the US than UK, France, and Germany are. The Muslim population in the US is much more integrated as part of the US. The Arab American population in the US has a higher per capita income and a higher education level than the average American. This is not the case for the UK, France, and Germany. There are lessons to be learned from the West Bank and Northern Ireland, both of which discovered that harsh investigative techniques backfired. What you really want to do is get the community on your side. So you probably remember, each time you go through an airport, you probably remember that at one time guys were trying to blow up planes by bringing liquids on planes and mixing the liquids and so on. So now you can, carry 3 ounces of something in, period. Well, the way that investigation was started was somebody in the community went to the police and said, I think you need to be investigating so-and-so. Or as Ian Blair, the London Police Commissioner, said, the whole idea is to engender the trust that one afternoon may allow one of these Islamic leaders to say to the sergeant, I'm worried about young so-and-so. Jane Harman, who was on the House Intelligence Committee, I believe the House Intelligence Committee, said the terror threat is going to be with us for a long time. It's a new, maybe generational challenge, and we have to learn to manage it as we devise better strategies, as we find out who's trying to attack us and prevent it. If we're here for the long term on this issue, we better not introduce long-term risks for short-term gain. So with that, thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Quick comment, which I had not been planning on
Okay.
making, and then an actual comment. The quick comment, which is peripheral, is having a chemistry background. The liquids on plane threat was rather implausible. I actually sent a very long message that got passed around to Dave Farber's list on this around the time. But larger issue, the thing that strikes me as being the biggest issue here is exemplified by the Greek situation, in which it's still unknown who the actors were. One can speculate,
Right.
but in which by building the tools for supposedly legitimate surveillance, we set ourselves up to be substantially less secure, because what happens when someone we don't like abuses the tools that we built for the people, that are supposedly doing things legitimately. And I've seen very little evidence that this message has really penetrated particularly far into the minds of the people who are greedily thinking about what they want to put in next.
Well, there are a couple of problems. One is that the technology is complicated, and it's sometimes hard for lawmakers to understand it. I was talking to one lawmaker who has a background in science, who's probably 10 years older than I am, and he said, we're waiting for the young guys to take over. This technology is just too hard for us. This is somebody with a background in science. Second part is, in Washington, I would say that, we're used to, as scientists and technologists, we're used to facts are all that matter. If the technology says you can't do it, if, whatever law, Boyle's law, whatever law says it can't be done, we know it can't be done. Okay, end of story. But in Washington, facts are only 10% of the equation. And there are lots of other pieces in the equation. And the third thing is that the surveillance side of the NSA seems at this point to be taking more of the lead than the information assurance side. And I'm not saying this so much with insider knowledge. I'm not saying it with insider knowledge so much as I would say that it's looking at it from the outside and watching the pressure from the political sides of Washington. We're seeing, let's do the surveillance without looking at the information assurance side. So yes, I completely agree with what you're saying.
One of the common phrases post 9/11 about what happened was failure to connect the dots. And it seems that what you summarized as sort of reactions to the event and what's been put in place is about collecting more dots and not about connecting the ones that were there, much less connecting new ones.
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the Patriot Act, it's a bill this thick that a few people have now read in its entirety. But you know that that bill was not written in the 5 days post-September 11th when it was first introduced into Congress. And I think calling it a wish list is not an exaggeration. If you read the September 11th report, the report by the Commission, it makes very clear that the information was there and it was a failure in lots of ways that didn't have to do with connecting the dots, including an FBI misinterpretation of what the wall between FISA and Title III was. But yes, I would agree with you. Now, I say that not being a data mining expert, and one of the problems in some of the discussions in Washington is that you have all the people in data mining saying, yes, yes, we can do this, throw more money at us. You don't have people who do data mining, or not very many of them, saying, that's not actually very easy to do, or this is a problem. So you're missing the technical expertise that is critical for the obvious reason that if it's critical, that it's not going to get the money.
Thank you.
Well, I guess you can, oh, no, you can't go home yet. Or I can't go home yet.
I got the one notion.
Could you get closer to the mic?
I got one notion, I don't know how valid it is. In my view, the whole system about the surveillance, it's a pretty much relict of the Cold War era, where the NSA, FBI had tangible, respectable, large-size enemy. After Cold War effectively ended, large enemy disappears, and therefore we need to either find one or invent one.
Well, you know, in the U.S., at least once I heard that the Communist Party in the U.S. only existed because of all of the FBI agents who had infiltrated it, which just goes more to your point. There's the old saying, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It is certainly the case that the wiretapping laws did not disappear in the 1980s or the 1990s as the Cold War ended. And in fact, we got CALEA applied to VoIP. When you train people to do a certain thing, sure, they want to keep doing it even when the enemy has changed. On the other hand, I have to say that there is some validity to the point that the issues have gotten more complicated for law enforcement and national security. The world was very dangerous, and I think probably the most dangerous time was actually October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there was also a certain stability, certainly by the 80s, between the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. With the demise of the USSR, there are all sorts of bad actors who had been constrained by the USSR and by the conflict between the USSR and the U.S. And now those bad actors are occurring in all sorts of places that it's hard to find out about them. They were controlled in other ways, and now they are appearing. So in defense of national security and law enforcement, and it's not a position I find myself in very often, there is a validity to the issue becoming more complicated and more difficult. Thank you.